Abraham Lincoln is well known for being the 16th President of the United States. He is known for fighting to preserve the Union. He is known for working to end slavery in the U.S. through the Emancipation Proclamation, though the groundwork for the end of slavery was laid in 1788 with Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, and the death knell would be sounded a few months after his death with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. He is even known for having been extremely honest in his business dealings. These facets of Lincoln's life are well remembered by the American public. Most people are also aware of his public speaking record. Arguably, the two best remembered speaking events that Lincoln was involved in was the Lincoln-Douglas debates and his Gettysburg Address. While these two events are certainly noteworthy, after all, the Lincoln-Douglas debates foreshadowed the collapse of the Union, they aren't politically relevant in the same way as some of Lincoln's other work. The address before the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois, retains its political relevance in a way that is certainly noteworthy. I recently read this speech for the first time and was awestruck at the timeless wisdom contained within. Like the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the address before the Lyceum is primarily about the preservation of the Union and all the institution it requires to perpetuate. Lincoln was preternaturally aware of the greatest threat to America, itself. The quote, "You cannot invade the mainland United States, there would be a rifle behind every blade of grass," is often attributed to Isokoro Yamamoto. But we see that in the second paragraph of the address that, at least domestically, the self-aggrandizing idea that the US is unconquerable has been around for quite a while. If this thought is true, and history would generally agree, then if the Union collapses, it is due to a fault in the Union. There was a moral error in the allowal of slavery. This moral error, however, was not the reason for the rift that was being felt even as far back as 1838. No, the rift was due to the legislative disparity between the states that allowed slavery and the states that did not. This incongruence would reach its breaking point with the inexcusable Dred Scott v. Sandford decision in 1857. Even in this overt subversion of law, Lincoln would not suggest that one has a right to violate other laws. He spends much time exploring how even justified outrage, if not self-tempered and self-controlled, invariably leads to even greater injustices. I was reminded of the riots over the past year. Some of the outrage may have been justified, but by August, a rapist was being defended by the mob. The general chaos has allowed autocratic politicians to take control. Lincoln has the belief that people love their government, but more and more that seems to be less the case. The trampling of the Constitution over the course of the last century, most notably by certain presidents and left-leaning academia, has killed the American devotion to one of the two most important documents to American governance. The other document, the Declaration of Independence, has thankfully avoided the damage done by the office of president, but has yet been unable to escape the vicious, illiberal claws of academia. Lincoln foreshadows the methods by which our institutions will be undermined, yet he also gives us the defenses by which we defend them. The destruction comes by ambitious individuals striving to be remembered as great, and for those who are less righteous than those who built society will seek greatness by destroying society. We see this flippant disregard for the truly good institutions that have held the Union together for 232 years today. Yet, even as we see the wanton destruction of every good thing, Lincoln gives the antidote to such vile ends. The prescription given is a position of righteousness. Violating the law, even if the law is unjust, leads to the continuation of lawbreaking, even just laws. Obviously, the proper course of action is to follow the unjust laws and to work to change them over time, because outright disobedience leads to a disrespect of the rule of law in general. Lincoln's point is the cautious side to err on. There are times in which violating the law may be necessary, but the justification must be rock solid and made clearly by the would-be rule breaker. The individual engaged in moral disobedience must strive to break as few laws as possible, lest a public disregard for order be developed and mob rule begin to thrive. Mob justice, which is no justice at all, is always morally reprehensible. Majoritarian systems strictly create chaos and injustice. There's a reason the US isn't a direct democracy. It's because democracy sucks. Instead, the US has a written document outlining the powers the government is allowed to exercise. As long as there's no governmental overstep, all is fine. Part of the threat of the document is that it creates norms for ideological opposition. If no one breaks the rules as written, there is little risk of political retribution from the other side. As a general rule, the big government party has created the most problems with regard to breaking the rules. To the people that find that offensive for some reason, tough, the Constitution is a small government document. It authorizes little in the way of things that the government can do, especially at the federal level. One of the ways that the Constitution attempts to keep autocrats from arising is to force them into competition with each other, hence the various checks and balances that used to be inherent in our government. Over time, many of the checks and balances that made an overreaching government difficult, if not impossible, have eroded due to immensely popular autocrats and difficult times that the morally weak think justify expanding government power. The best post-Lincoln example of how a president should exercise their power domestically is Coolidge, without question. The Constitution mostly gives diplomatic and military power to the president. It gives little in the way of domestic power. This is relevant to know and keep in mind when fascistic nightmares, like that one dude from my state, try to run for president and say things like, "Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15. Even if that didn't violate the Second Amendment, the president doesn't have the legal power to do anything about it. Lincoln suggests that for the ambitious, destructive power seekers, the moral course of action is to impede his ability to create problems. The last little section that Lincoln gives is about social cohesion. We, as Americans, have generally found ourselves capable of great unity when we have a common enemy. As Lincoln points out, for much of our early history, that was the British. A few decades after Lincoln's presidency, the Spanish would be that enemy, then the Germans shortly thereafter, and finally the Germans again. We haven't really had a true national enemy since then. Sure, we fought the Soviets immediately following the second time we fought the Germans, but our fight was more between the anti-Soviets and the Soviet sympathizers here in the US. The Cold War was more about ourselves than opposing the evils of communism. If we had a conscience, our unifying foe today would probably be China, but we look around for an enemy and all we can see is America. Lincoln would have been unable to see the relevance of his statement at the time. The US hadn't ever split then, and our generally domestic issues had been overshadowed by our foreign issues. Until about a decade ago, the US had a memory of a half-hearted foe, but now a generation, myself included, has reached an age to have a political voice, and our vanquished foe's sympathizers have worked their ideological poison into many of the channels by which Americans figure out how to view the world. The older generation hasn't learned yet that objectivity is quickly becoming a thing of the past. Moral strength is being tested and the US is failing. How could it not? The younger generations have largely bought into lies propagated by anti-American parties. The institution that does the most for inculcating moral truth has declined over the years, that being organized religious institutions. I don't know how the US will survive, but I certainly hope it does. History gives us in Lincoln a great example of a man who preserved the Union through hard work and an unshakable belief in its goodness. His ideological opponent, Stephen Douglas, believed the same as well. Short of a generalized agreement that the Union is good, the greatest geopolitical experiment will not survive another 200 years. Let us take Lincoln's example and strive to follow it.